Gerson and ELIEZER, sons of Moses, grew up under a singular shadow, that of the man chosen by God to challenge an empire, free a people, and guide them through an endless desert. Although their stories are rarely mentioned, they are far from insignificant. Marked by hidden challenges and an almost enigmatic silence, Gerson and ELIEZER played a crucial role in the continuity of the divine promise. In this narrative, we delve into the journeys of these two brothers, exploring how, even out of the spotlight, they carried the weight of a sacred heritage and built a discreet but immensely powerful legacy that echoes to this day. Subscribe to the channel for more exciting biblical stories and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any videos. It was a hot day in Midian, the kind of heat that made the horizon tremble as if dancing with the dry desert wind. There, in that remote place, far from the Egypt he had left behind, Moses held his first son Gerson in his arms. The name he chose was not just a word, but a cry from his soul. "I am a stranger in a foreign land," he murmured, as he looked at the small face that seemed so fragile, but carried with it a promise of continuity. Moses was no longer the prince of the golden sands of Egypt, but an exiled man, a shepherd, living among a people who were not his own. Every curve of his face bore the marks of time and the weight of past decisions. Gerson was born in this context, not in a palace, but in a humble shelter, surrounded by the deafening silence of the desert and the watchful gaze of the stars. The days passed, and the boy grew up amidst the dust to the sound of his father's stories about distant times and miracles that seemed as impossible as the sky raining in that desert. But there was something more in Gerson, a sparkle in his eyes, as if he already understood that his existence was bigger than himself. He was the symbol of new life, the living memory that God does not abandon, even in strange lands. And then came ELIEZER, his brother. His name was another mark of faith. "The God of my father was my help and delivered me from the sword of Pharaoh." This was the silent testimony of Moses, echoing through his children. Little ELIEZER brought with him the memory of liberation and the promise that even in the midst of danger, divine help was never far away. Time passed, and Gerson and ELIEZER left the fragility of childhood behind, transforming into young people who, without even realizing it, carried a weight greater than the simple years of their lives. What did it mean to be the son of Moses? For them, this was a question that hung in the air, with no clear answer. They were simple days, but full of hidden meanings. Between trips through the desert, as they helped tend the sheep or listened to their father's words around the campfire, they began to understand, albeit in a subtle way, that their lives would not be ordinary. Growing up under the eyes of Moses was like living between two worlds. On one side, there was the simple man, a sheep herder, who taught practical lessons about life in the desert, how to find water in apparently dead soil, or how to protect yourself from the sharp winds of the dunes. On the other, there was the leader who carried stories that seemed too big to fit into words. The plagues of Egypt, the confrontation with Pharaoh, the sea that opened like giant doors. All of this was like a dream told by the fire, but Moses' eyes, so full of mystery, said it was real. However, there was a silence to it all. Moses rarely spoke directly about what he expected of his children. He loved them, that was clear, but he always seemed caught up in something bigger, something that no one but himself could fully understand. And, perhaps because of this, Gerson and ELIEZER felt like pieces of a divine puzzle that they had not yet put together. The nights in the desert were a spectacle in themselves. Under the star-studded sky, the silence felt alive, almost as if it whispered ancient secrets. It was in this environment that Gerson and ELIEZER began to realize that the desert, despite being arid and relentless, held lessons that went beyond what the eyes could see. Moses, with his staff always at hand, often stopped to look at the horizon as if waiting for something. "The desert speaks," he said in a mysterious tone, "but you have to learn to listen." The brothers grew up surrounded by this almost supernatural atmosphere. Each sandstorm, each water spring found amidst the vastness seemed to be more than simple everyday events. They were like coded messages shaping their souls. Little by little, they began to understand that the desert was more than a place. It was a test, not just for the body, but also for the heart. And in a way, it seemed that God himself was using that dry land to prepare the two brothers, just as he had already done with Moses. Even though they still didn't fully understand, Gerson and ELIEZER felt that something bigger was waiting for them. There were times when Moses would disappear for hours, sometimes days, leaving them with Zipporah, his mother, or the elders of Midian. When he returned, he seemed quieter, more thoughtful. These intervals, shrouded in mystery, left the brothers uneasy. What occupied his father's mind so much? Was it the weight of his mission, or something he wasn't yet ready to share? As they grew, their questions only increased. They didn't know that the answer wasn't just in the desert, but also within them. Like two birds in a nest, they felt that the time to fly was approaching. And Moses, even without saying a word, seemed to know that this moment was getting closer. The desert wind continued to blow, bringing with it omens of something to come, something that would change everything. As the years went by, Gerson and ELIEZER began to notice something curious. Amidst the grandiose stories full of miracles that they heard about their father, there were gaps, silences that were never filled. Why did Moses rarely talk about the days in Egypt before he became a shepherd? What made him run so far? The stories of the burning bush and the plagues were impressive, but they left questions hanging in the air. It was as if Moses' past was buried under layers of sand, like so many secrets of the desert. The two brothers also noticed that while the people of Israel grew in importance in their father's narrative, they seemed to remain on the sidelines. Moses spoke about the tribes, about God's covenant, about the commandments that would be given in the future, but it never clearly said where Gerson and ELIEZER fit into all of this. This silence was, at the same time, frustrating and fascinating. They asked themselves, are we part of this great story or just spectators? The weight of being Moses' children followed them like a shadow, but the world around them didn't seem to notice them. When Moses walked among the people, carrying his staff, everyone looked at him with reverence. But Gerson and ELIEZER, they went unnoticed, as if they were stones in the way. Was this a coincidence or something deliberate? Perhaps Moses himself had chosen to keep them at a distance, protecting them from something they could not yet understand. This apparent anonymity, however, hid something deeper. They were like seeds dropped into the ground, invisible for now, but full of potential. And somehow, the silence of Scripture seemed to carry a foreshadowing. The role of Gerson and ELIEZER had not yet been revealed. The desert, with its tireless winds, continued to whisper stories that no one else seemed to hear. There was a night when the sky seemed lower, as if the stars were stretching their arms until they touched the desert. Gerson and ELIEZER, sitting around the fire, looked at the glow of the flames dancing in the wind, while their father, in silence, ran his fingers over the weathered staff. That wood, which had already witnessed so many miracles, seemed to carry more stories than Moses himself let slip. That night, Moses broke the silence. He did not tell a new story of plagues or deliverances, talked about inheritance, not about land or riches, but something much more precious. What God has given me, my children, is not something that can be kept in trunks or measured with numbers. It is a responsibility. He looked into the fire as if searching for answers in it, and his voice carried a mixture of weight and hope. You are part of this, even if you don't understand it yet. Gerson felt the weight of his father's words. What did it mean to inherit something invisible, something that couldn't be touched but would change your life? ELIEZER, younger, just listened, but his eyes showed the same concern. It was as if Moses were planting seeds that would only germinate much later. Moses' spiritual inheritance was not made up of immediate glories, but of promises that required patience, faith, and sacrifice. The brothers knew that this conversation was not by chance. Moses spoke carefully, as if leaving clues to buried treasure. "God does not choose the strongest or the wisest, but the willing," he said, with a twinkle in his eye that seemed to span time. Gerson and ELIEZER felt the weight of being children of a man who walked between two worlds, the human and the divine. The wind blew hard, stirring up grains of sand that swirled around the fire as if the desert was listening. Moses' silence after those words said more than he could ever explain. The desert seemed infinite, but the people's steps were guided by something greater. Gerson, now older, was beginning to understand the role his name played. He was, after all, the stranger in a foreign land, and that identity seemed to blend with Israel's own journey. Between tents and trails, he gained responsibilities, especially alongside the Levites, those chosen to take care of sacred things. It was a job that required more than physical strength. It was a call to protect what was holy, even if the people around did not realize the importance of it. Gerson and his descendants were in charge of something apparently simple, carrying the curtains and fabrics of the tabernacle. For many, this seemed like a practical task, almost meaningless. But for him, there was something more. The curtains were not just cloths. They were the separation between the people and the presence of God. Each fold, each thread carried with it the weight of the sacred. When touching those fabrics, Gerson felt as if he were dealing with the very heart of the desert where God dwelt. As they walked, the tabernacle was dismantled and reassembled so many times that the process became almost a choreography. Each movement had an order, a meaning, as if it echoed the very voice of God. Gerson realized that even without being at the center of great stories, he and his lineage were indispensable. It was as if they literally carried the divine presence in their hands. ELIEZER, in turn, watched his brother. He knew that Gerson's responsibility was great, but he also felt that something different awaited him. While Gerson assumed his position among the Levites, ELIEZER grew up amid an atmosphere of unspoken expectations. Unlike his brother, who seemed to have found his place by carrying the curtains of the tabernacle, ELIEZER had a restless look, as if he felt that the desert held something more for him. His name, which meant, "The God of my father was my help," seemed to pulse like a constant reminder that his life had a unique purpose, albeit one still shrouded in mystery. At his father's side, ELIEZER learned to observe. He saw how Moses, even in the midst of leading such an obstinate people, found time to collect himself and listen to the voice of God. This silence, full of meanings, awakened something in ELIEZER. He didn't have the weight of leading the people like his father, nor the practical task of Gerson, but something inside him whispered that his role was linked to continuity. Perhaps it was something that he would not even live to see, but that would be born from his lineage, like a promise buried in time. One night, while the camp was resting, Moses called ELIEZER to walk under the stars. The moonlight illuminated the desert, and the silence was broken only by the sound of footsteps on the sand. "ELIEZER," Moses began, "what we carry within us is greater than what we carry in our hands. The God who delivered me from Pharaoh's sword will also deliver you from whatever comes next." His father's words weren't just advice, they were a foreshadowing, a revelation disguised as simplicity. ELIEZER kept those words in his heart, even without fully understanding what they meant. The days in the desert were all similar, but never the same. There was something in the air that seemed to test each person's limits, as if the wind itself knew what they carried inside them. For Gerson and ELIEZER, the weight of being Moses' children never completely disappeared. Sometimes it was a silent burden, other times a responsibility that demanded more than they could offer. They grew up knowing that their father was not just a leader, but a man chosen by God, and that choice somehow included them, even if they didn't know exactly how. But there was something the two brothers shared, the constant internal conflict between being recognized for who they were and losing themselves in Moses' shadow. When they walked among the tribes, they saw how other men their age had clear paths, simple responsibilities. Herding, hunting, building, Gerson and ELIEZER did not have that luxury. Their lives were shaped by a purpose that no one seemed to fully explain. They were not like Aaron and his sons, who were clearly destined for the priesthood. They were not like the elders, whose wisdom made them pillars for the people. So where exactly did they fit in? Gerson, with his role among the Gersonites, sometimes found himself overwhelmed by the practicality of his role, but the hard work was a distraction from his doubts. ELIEZER, on the other hand, had a more contemplative spirit. He questioned silently, trying to understand what it meant to be the youngest son of a man who spoke to God. Was his name, which evoked divine protection, just a reminder of the past or a harbinger of the future? As they walked side by side on one of their many journeys through the desert, ELIEZER turned to Gerson and asked, "Do you think our role is just to carry the things that Father built? Or do we still have something to build too?" Gerson looked at the horizon and sighed. ELIEZER's questions seemed to mirror his own, but he had no answers. Time continued like the dunes of the desert, always moving, always changing. Gerson and ELIEZER were now grown men, but they still walked under the invisible gaze of something greater. Moses' name echoed among the people like a living legend, but the liberator's children remained on the margins of this great story, almost as if they were footnotes in a sacred text. It wasn't for lack of effort. They were there day after day, fulfilling their roles, carrying the curtains of the tabernacle or observing from afar the miraculous acts of their Father. But there was a lingering feeling that their lives were like the dim stars in the sky, visible only to those who knew where to look. Little by little, the silence that surrounded Gerson and ELIEZER became a kind of mystery. Their lineages began to mix with the rest of the people, their names being mentioned only in genealogical records and in brief moments in the Levitical histories. It was almost as if their destiny lay not in visible glories, but in something more discreet, almost imperceptible. Perhaps it was there, in the hidden details, that its true importance lay. The people around them barely noticed the continuity that flowed through them. For the children of Moses, it was not necessary to be the center of attention. They learned from the desert, from the wind that never stops blowing, from the stars that guide, even without being touched. His descendants would be the guardians of this stillness, keeping alive the invisible thread that connected Moses' calling to Israel's future. Once, as the camp rested under a sky full of promises, a traveler passed by, bringing stories of new lands, new challenges. Gerson and ELIEZER listened in silence, but something inside them seemed restless, as if they knew that these stories were not just on the horizon, they were also inside them, waiting for the right moment to awaken. The desert was never just a place. He was a master, an invisible sculptor who shaped lives with sand and silence. For Gerson and ELIEZER, each day carried a mystery that seemed to slip through their fingers. They were not destined to be like their father, but neither were they like the other children of Israel. There was something unique about their journeys, something that could not be seen, but felt, like the wind that dances formlessly through the dunes. The years passed, and the people began to approach the promised land. The walk seemed endless, but each step led further away from Egypt and closer to a new beginning. For the children of Moses, this advancement was both physical and spiritual. Gerson, with his practical responsibility, and ELIEZER, with his contemplative restlessness, understood that the weight of their legacies was not in immediate glories, but in supporting a history greater than themselves. The desert, in its silent wisdom, seemed to teach that not all stories need to be shouted to be important. While Moses' name echoed among the people like thunder, his children's legacy was like the dew that appeared in the morning, discreet but essential. They were the continuity, the invisible threads that kept the tapestry of divine calling alive. And then came the moment when Moses, tired from years and battles, climbed Mount Nebo. Gerson and ELIEZER were not with him at that moment, but perhaps that was appropriate. Moses' story came to an end, but theirs continued, woven by the hands of their descendants, mixed with the destiny of the chosen people. In the desert, the sun was rising once again, shining light on a new generation. The lessons that Gerson and ELIEZER carried in silence were now passed on to others, spreading like seeds that the wind threw to the earth. And so, the cycle continued, like the eternal movement of the stars in the sky. The story didn't end. She just hoped to be told again, by other voices, in another time. The desert was behind us, but its lessons never left those who walked through it. Gerson and ELIEZER, sons of one of the greatest leaders in Israel's history, were not prominent figures, but that was precisely the essence of their contribution. They teach us that not everyone is destined for the spotlight, and that doesn't lessen the impact of their lives. Just like the stars that guided the people through the night, their importance was in shining in silence, supporting the journey. The legacy of Gerson and ELIEZER was not made up of immediate glories, but of continuity. They were the invisible guardians of a promise, sustaining the divine presence among the people. Their stories show us that there is strength in accepting responsibilities, even when they seem small or insignificant. After all, they were the threads that held the tapestry together, allowing God's great acts a space to manifest. There is also something deeply human in ELIEZER's restlessness and Gerson's practical dedication. They were ordinary men, trying to understand their role in a story much bigger than themselves. And isn't it like that with us? We often wonder if our actions matter, if we are leaving a mark. Their story reminds us that even when we are part of something that seems invisible, we are contributing to something eternal. The journey of Moses' children ends, but their example continues. They teach us that greatness is not just in great deeds, but in daily fidelity, in acts of service that support the mission. Just as the wilderness shaped their lives, our trials also prepare us for the purpose God has for us, even if we never see it in full. And like the desert wind, their lives continue to blow among us, bringing the reminder that everyone has a place in divine history, even if that place is built in silence. True heritage is passed from generation to generation, like a flame that never goes out. If you like the story of the children of Moses and want to continue following other stories of faith and overcoming, be sure to like this video and share it with those you love. And of course, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any new content. Together, let's explore more powerful lessons from the Bible.